What would you do if a single act of kindness cost you everything? Ethan, a hard-working young man, pays for an elderly couple's groceries when they can't. But his good deed backfires. He loses his job, his relationship, and his sense of security. As his life unravels, Ethan stumbles upon a dark secret involving someone powerful in his town. Now he must decide. Will he stay silent or risk everything to uncover the truth? Curious about what happens next? Join Ethan on his journey of resilience and justice. Like, comment, and subscribe if you love stories about standing up for what's right. And don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss the rest of the story. Ethan Davis glanced at the clock mounted above the supermarket checkout lanes. The hands crept slowly toward 9 p.m. May, the end of another exhausting day at Carlson's Market, the small grocery store where he had worked for the past year. Outside, the sun had long disappeared behind the Ridgewood Hills, casting the town into the soft glow of streetlights. But inside the store, the harsh fluorescent bulbs hummed, casting a sterile, lifeless light over the rows of groceries and worn linoleum. It wasn't the life Ethan had envisioned for himself. At 18, he had imagined being on his way to college by now, maybe even studying business or something creative like design. Instead, he was here, ringing up groceries and dealing with impatient customers. He had no choice but to work. His mother, Sophie Davis, was struggling to make ends meet, and with her declining health, Ethan had stepped up to help her. She worked long hours as a waitress at the local diner, but her wages weren't enough to cover the mounting medical bills, rent, and daily expenses. It was Ethan's income that filled in the gaps, though even that wasn't nearly enough. The heavy weight of responsibility pressed down on him every day. His friends from high school had either left town or moved on to better things, while Ethan stayed behind, tethered to Ridgewood by a sense of duty and guilt. He knew his mother needed him, but he couldn't help but feel trapped. His life seemed stuck, like the hands of the clock that moved so slowly above him. As Ethan leaned against the counter, his thoughts drifted to Lindsay Parker, his girlfriend of just over a year. Lindsay was one of the few things in his life that brought him genuine happiness, though lately things between them hadn't been the same. She came from a wealthier family and had always lived a life of comfort. She was used to the nicer things, and Ethan could sense her growing frustration with his inability to provide those things for her. Tonight, Lindsay was having her birthday party, a small gathering of friends and family at her parents' house. Ethan had planned on going after his shift, but he hadn't been able to buy her the gift he had wanted. He had saved up for weeks, hoping to get her a necklace she had admired in the local jewelry store. But each time he came close to the amount he needed, something came up. A medical bill for his mom, a higher-than-expected electric bill, or groceries. Now, with only a handful of dollars left in his pocket, he knew he would be arriving at the party empty-handed. The thought of it made his stomach churn. Lindsay had been understanding up to a point, but he knew her patience was wearing thin. She had once dated Matt Reynolds, the son of Tom Harris, the manager of Carlson's Market. Matt was the kind of guy who had everything handed to him. Fancy clothes, a new car every couple of years, the best schools. Ethan was nothing like Matt, and while Lindsay had chosen him, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was constantly being measured against her ex-boyfriend. Just as Ethan's mind began to spiral deeper into his worries, the bell above the front door chimed, signaling the arrival of another customer. He straightened up, pulling himself out of his thoughts, and plastered on a polite smile. Through the doors shuffled an elderly couple, Beth and James Carter. They were regulars at the store, though they didn't come in often. When they did, it was always for the basics: bread, milk, a few vegetables, and the medication James needed for his chronic illness. Ethan knew them by sight, though they had never spoken much beyond the usual pleasantries exchanged at the checkout line. Beth and James were well known in the community for their kindness. They had lived in Ridgewood for over 50 years, and though their financial situation had worsened over time, they remained the kind of people who would offer help to anyone who needed it. Ethan had heard stories from other customers about how the Carters had once run a small bookstore in town, a local hub where children had gathered after school and neighbors had met for coffee. But that was long ago. Now the bookstore was closed, and Beth and James lived on a meager pension that barely covered their needs. As they made their way slowly through the aisles, Ethan watched them out of the corner of his eye. James moved cautiously, leaning heavily on his cane, while Beth guided their cart. Their pace was slow, and Ethan could see the strain on their faces as they picked out their groceries. It was a familiar sight, people doing what they could to make their money stretch just a little further. Ethan felt a pang of sympathy as they approached the checkout line. He greeted them with a smile, though his heart was heavy. "Evening, Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter?" Ethan said, his tone light. "How's everything going today?" Beth gave him a soft smile, though there was weariness in her eyes. "Oh, you know, dear, we're getting by." James didn't speak, his attention focused on the floor. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the handle of his cane, his once strong frame now thin and fragile. Ethan began scanning their items: bread, milk, a few apples, and James's medication. He could see from the choices they made that they were only buying what they absolutely needed. The total came to $43.52, a modest amount, but Ethan knew it was likely a stretch for them. Beth reached into her purse, her movements slow and deliberate. Her brow furrowed as she searched, pulling out a few small items: keys, tissues, an old receipt, but no wallet. Panic flickered across her face as she looked up at James, her voice trembling. "James, I think I left the wallet at home," she whispered, her face paling. James patted his pockets, his expression mirroring Beth's growing anxiety. I don't have it either," he muttered, his voice weak. An awkward silence settled over the moment, broken only by the faint hum of the store's overhead lights. Ethan could feel the tension, the embarrassment radiating from the couple as they stood there, unable to pay. Beth's hands shook as she fumbled with her purse, her eyes wide with worry. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. He knew what it was like to be in their position, scraping by, wondering if the money you had would be enough to cover your basic needs. He had seen his mother go through the same thing, choosing which bills to pay and which to let slide, always trying to stretch every dollar. And now, here were Beth and James, two people who had lived long, hard-working lives, standing in front of him, unsure of what to do. He glanced down at the total on the screen, then reached into his own pocket, feeling the few crumpled bills he had left. It was the money he had been saving for Lindsay's birthday gift. Not much, just enough for a small gesture, but it had taken him weeks to gather it. The necklace he had wanted to buy was no longer an option, but maybe he could find something smaller, something meaningful, to show her he cared. But as he looked back at Beth and James, his heart sank. They needed this more than he needed a gift. The decision was instantaneous. Without a second thought, Ethan pulled out the money and handed it to Beth. "Don't worry about it," Ethan said softly, trying to sound casual. "I've got this." Beth's eyes widened in shock, her hand hovering over the money, hesitant to take it. "Oh no, dear, we couldn't possibly accept this." "Please," Ethan insisted, his voice steady. "It's no problem. You need this more than I do." Beth's eyes brimmed with tears as she finally accepted the money, her hands trembling as she clutched the bills. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We'll never forget this, Ethan. You've helped us more than you know." James nodded in agreement, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Bless you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As they left the store, bags in hand, Ethan watched the automatic doors slide shut behind them. His heart swelled with a strange mix of emotions: satisfaction, relief, and a twinge of sadness. He had done the right thing, but at what cost? The money he had saved was gone, and with it, any chance of getting Lindsay the gift he had promised her. He knew she would understand. She always said she didn't care about material things, but still, the thought of showing up empty-handed filled him with dread. He didn't regret helping Beth and James, not for a second. But as he stood there, alone at the checkout counter, the weight of the world seemed to press down on him even harder. The next day, as Ethan walked through the town on his way to work, his thoughts were consumed by the events of the previous evening. The look of gratitude on Beth and James's faces still lingered in his mind, but so did the gnawing anxiety about Lindsay's birthday party that evening. He had never arrived at a celebration empty-handed before, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this time it would be different. By the time Ethan arrived at Carlson's market, he had convinced himself that things might not be as bad as they seemed. Maybe Lindsay would understand. Maybe Beth and James would find a way to pay him back. Maybe the manager wouldn't even notice the missing $43,522 from the register. After all, it wasn't like Ethan had stolen anything. He had simply stepped in when someone else couldn't pay. But as soon as Ethan walked through the store's doors, he saw Tom Harris standing by the customer service desk, his arms crossed and a scowl on his face. Tom was tall and broad, with sharp features that seemed perpetually set in a frown. His presence was intimidating, even on the best of days, and Ethan immediately felt a sense of dread wash over him. "Davis," Tom called out, his voice cutting through the quiet store. "I need to talk to you." Ethan's heart sank. He walked over to Tom, his hands beginning to sweat. "Morning, Mr. Harris?" Ethan greeted him, trying to keep his voice steady. "Is everything okay?" Tom's frown deepened as he looked Ethan up and down, his eyes cold and calculating. "Do you know what you did yesterday?" Ethan blinked, confused. "Yesterday? You paid for a customer's groceries," Tom said, his voice low but hard. "Out of your own pocket." Ethan felt his blood run cold. He hadn't expected Tom to know about it so soon. "Yes, sir. I did. They didn't have any money and I couldn't just let them go without their groceries. It wasn't much." Tom cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "This isn't a charity, Davis. This is a business." Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew what was coming, but he couldn't stop himself from defending his actions. "I understand, sir, but it was only $43. I paid for it myself. It didn't cost the store anything." Tom's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. "That's not the point. You violated store policy. We don't give handouts here, Davis. If a customer can't pay, they leave empty-handed. That's the rule." Ethan could feel his anger bubbling beneath the surface. He had tried to do the right thing, to help people in need, and now he was being punished for it. It didn't seem fair. "They needed that food and medicine, Mr. Harris," Ethan said, his voice rising slightly. "I couldn't just let them leave with nothing. It wasn't right." Tom's face hardened, his jaw clenching. "You don't make the rules here, Davis. I do. And what you did was a mistake. A mistake that this store can't afford." Ethan's frustration boiled over. "A mistake? You're calling helping people a mistake?" Tom didn't flinch. "Yes. And because of that, you're fired." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. "Fired? For helping someone?" He opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Tom's eyes told him it was useless. There was no changing his mind. "Collect your things and leave," Tom said coldly. "You're done here." Ethan stood there stunned, as Tom turned and walked away. Fired. He had lost his job, and for what? For doing what he thought was right? His heart raced as he walked to the back room, grabbed his backpack from his locker, and left the store for the last time. As he stepped outside, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. He had lost his job, and with it, his only source of income. The thought of how he would tell his mother made his stomach turn. She was already working herself to exhaustion, and now Ethan had just added to their problems. But there was no time to dwell on it. He had to figure out what to do next. Hours later, Ethan found himself standing outside Lindsay's house, watching through the windows as her birthday party unfolded inside. It was everything he had feared. Her friends and family were gathered around, laughing and talking. The room filled with gifts and decorations. And there he was, standing on the front lawn, empty-handed and feeling like an intruder. He hadn't told her about losing his job yet. He hadn't even told her about paying for Beth and James's groceries. How could he explain any of it? How could he tell her that the gift he had saved for was gone? That he had spent his last few dollars on someone else's groceries instead of on her birthday present? As he stood there debating whether to turn around and leave, the front door opened, and there she was. Lindsay, her long blonde hair glowing in the soft light of the party. Her smile, however, faded when she saw the look on Ethan's face and the empty space in his hands. "You didn't bring anything?" she asked, her voice tinged with disappointment. Ethan's heart sank. I really wanted to, but something happened at work today and—" Lindsay crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "You always have a reason, Ethan." You always have an excuse." "No, it's not like that," Ethan pleaded. "I lost my job because I helped someone. I paid for their groceries because they couldn't and—" "You lost your job?" Lindsay's voice rose, cutting him off. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to worry you," Ethan admitted, feeling the weight of her disappointment. "I thought I could fix it, but I didn't want you to be upset." "Well, I am upset, Ethan," Lindsay said, her arms dropping to her sides. "You promised you'd be here for me, and you didn't even bring me a gift." "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, his throat tightening. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Lindsay sighed, looking at him with a mix of sadness and frustration. "I can't keep doing this, Ethan. I can't keep being with someone who's always struggling. I need more than this." Her words hit him like a slap in the face. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud was a different kind of pain. He felt the ground slip away beneath him. "I think we should break up," Lindsay said, her voice final. And just like that, it was over. She turned and walked back inside, leaving Ethan standing on the porch, his heart shattered into a million pieces. The streets of Ridgewood were eerily quiet that night as Ethan wandered aimlessly through the town. The distant glow of streetlights flickered in the misty evening air. But to Ethan, the world felt cold and lifeless. His mind was spinning, replaying the events of the day in an endless loop. Losing his job, being fired for trying to do the right thing. And then the crushing blow of Lindsay's words echoing in his ears. "I think we should break up." It wasn't just the end of his job or even the end of his relationship that weighed on him. It was the feeling of being utterly lost, as though everything he had worked for, everything he had cared about, had crumbled in his hands. He had tried to help someone, tried to make a difference in the world, and for that, he had been punished. Ethan shoved his hands deep into his jacket pockets, his breath visible in the cool night air. His thoughts drifted to his mother, Sophie, who had no idea that he had lost his job. How was he supposed to tell her? She was already working herself to the bone to keep their heads above water, barely able to cover the rent and bills. Now Ethan had made things worse. Without his income, they would be in even deeper trouble. A lump formed in his throat, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He had always prided himself on being strong, on holding it together for his mom's sake. But tonight, he wasn't sure how much longer he could carry the weight of everything. As he turned a corner, his eyes landed on a familiar sight. A small, dimly lit alleyway where he often saw people rummaging through trash bins, collecting recyclables to sell. And there, huddled together in the cold, were Beth and James Carter. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his heart sinking at the sight of them. The elderly couple, who had once been pillars of the community, now looked more fragile than ever. Beth, with her hunched frame and wrinkled hands, was carefully sorting through bottles and cans, while James, leaning heavily on his cane, tried to keep steady. Their clothes were worn and thin, offering little protection from the chill in the air. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, watching them in silence. He had helped them the day before at the supermarket, thinking that he was doing a small kindness. But now, seeing them like this, reduced to scavenging for recyclables just to make ends meet, he realized how deep their struggle truly ran. Unable to stand by any longer, Ethan walked over to them, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty alley. "Mr. Carter? Mrs. Carter?" Beth looked up, startled by his voice. When she saw Ethan, her expression softened into a tired but grateful smile. "Ethan, dear, what are you doing out here so late?" "I could ask you the same thing," Ethan replied, crouching down beside her. "Why are you doing this? You shouldn't have to be out here like this." Beth sighed, glancing at James before turning back to Ethan. "Oh, we're just trying to make a little extra money. It's been hard lately, with the medical bills and everything, but we manage." Ethan's heart ached at her words. They managed, but just barely. He could see it in their tired eyes, in the way James' hands trembled as he leaned on his cane. The reality of their situation was far worse than he had imagined. "You don't have to do this alone," Ethan said softly. "I can help. Let me help." Beth shook her head gently, though there was gratitude in her eyes. "You've already done enough for us, dear. We don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Ethan insisted. "I want to help." Without waiting for an answer, Ethan began sorting through the bottles and cans alongside them, organizing them into neat piles. The work was menial, but it felt like the least he could do in that moment. As they worked in silence, Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of how he could do more. He had lost his job, but there had to be other ways to help people like Beth and James. There had to be. After a while, James spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "We appreciate what you did for us yesterday, Ethan. You didn't have to, but you did, and that means more to us than you'll ever know." Ethan looked up at him, feeling a surge of emotion rise in his chest. "I'm glad I could help, but it came at a price. I lost my job because of it." Beth gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh no, Ethan. We never wanted you to get in trouble." "It's not your fault," Ethan said quickly, shaking his head. "I'd do it all over again. I don't regret it." They sat in silence for a moment, the distant hum of the town creating a melancholic backdrop to their conversation. Ethan could feel the weight of their struggles pressing down on him, but at the same time, something stirred inside him. A quiet determination to do more, to be more. He couldn't just walk away from this. Not now. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. The sky outside his window was still dark, the faintest hint of dawn just beginning to creep over the horizon. He rubbed his eyes, squinting at the screen. It was a text message from Mark Jackson, his best friend and co-worker at Carlson's Market. "Mark. Hey man, need to talk. Something's not right." Ethan's heart sank as he read the message. After everything that had happened the day before, getting fired, helping Beth and James, losing Lindsay, he wasn't sure he had the energy to deal with anything else. But Mark sounded urgent and Ethan trusted him more than anyone. He quickly threw on some clothes and left the apartment, careful not to wake his mother, who was still asleep in the next room. The cold morning air bit at his skin as he made his way to the small park where he and Mark often met. It was a place of refuge for them, a quiet spot where they could talk about life, away from the pressures of work and family. When Ethan arrived, Mark was already there, pacing nervously near the swing set. His face was pale, his brow furrowed with worry. Something was definitely wrong. "Mark, what's going on?" Ethan asked, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Mark stopped pacing and looked up, his eyes filled with anxiety. "Ethan, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday. You getting fired for paying for those groceries. It doesn't sit right with me. And then I saw something I can't ignore." Ethan frowned, stepping closer. "What are you talking about?" Mark lowered his voice, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. "I was working in the back yesterday after you left. I saw Matt Reynolds, Tom's son, out in the parking lot. He was hanging around, looking suspicious. And then I saw him pick something up off the ground. Something that looked like a wallet." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "A wallet? Whose wallet?" "I don't know," Mark admitted, shaking his head. "But I saw him pocket it, and then he just walked away, like nothing happened." Ethan felt his stomach churn. He remembered Beth and James at the store the day before, searching frantically for their wallet, when they realized they had forgotten it. Could it be? Could Matt have taken their money? "I think it was Beth and James's wallet," Ethan said, his voice low. "They couldn't pay for their groceries because they thought they left it at home." Mark's eyes widened in realization. If that's true, Matt stole from them. Ethan clenched his fists, anger bubbling up inside him. Matt Reynolds, with his privileged life and careless attitude, had stolen from an elderly couple who could barely afford to survive. And worse, Tom had fired Ethan for trying to help them, while covering for his son's crime. "This is unbelievable," Ethan muttered, pacing in frustration. "Matt's gotten away with everything his whole life. And now he's stealing from people like Beth and James? It's disgusting." "I don't know what to do," Mark admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "I need this job, Ethan. If I say something, I could lose it. But I can't just stay quiet." Ethan understood Mark's fear. They were both struggling to make ends meet, and losing his job could be devastating for Mark. But Ethan couldn't stand by and let this go. He had already lost everything: his job, his relationship, his stability. What more did he have to lose? "We can't stay quiet about this," Ethan said firmly. "Matt has to be held accountable." "But how?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with worry. Tom will protect him like he always does. No one will believe us without proof. Ethan paused, thinking. Mark was right. Accusing Matt of theft without concrete evidence could backfire, especially since Tom ran the store. But there had to be a way to expose the truth, a way to make sure justice was served. I don't know yet, Ethan admitted, but we'll find a way. We have to. As Ethan walked home from his meeting with Mark, his mind was consumed with thoughts of what to do next. The injustice of it all burned inside him. Matt Reynolds, the spoiled son of the store manager, stealing from people who had nothing, while Ethan, who had tried to do the right thing, had been cast aside. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. They needed a plan, a way to expose Matt without putting themselves at risk. When Ethan arrived back at the apartment, the smell of burnt toast greeted him at the door. His mother, Sophie, was standing at the stove, her back to him, as she attempted to scrape the charred remains of breakfast into the trash. "Morning, Mom," Ethan said, forcing a smile as he entered the kitchen. Sophie turned, giving him a tired smile in return. "Morning, sweetheart. You're up early. I didn't hear you leave. Just needed to clear my head," Ethan replied, grabbing a glass of water. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to tell her the truth. "Mom, something happened at work yesterday." Sophie's smile faded, concern filling her eyes. "What is it, Ethan? Did something happen with Tom?" Ethan nodded, his heart heavy. "I got fired," Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What? Why? What happened?" Ethan explained everything, the elderly couple paying for their groceries, and how Tom had fired him for breaking store policy. He left out the part about Matt stealing the wallet, unsure of how to broach that topic just yet. Sophie listened in silence, her expression a mix of disbelief and sadness. When Ethan finished, she sighed deeply, sitting down at the small kitchen table. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. You were just trying to help." "I know," Ethan replied, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settle over him. "But now we're in trouble. Without my income, I don't know how we're going to make it." Sophie reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "We'll figure it out. We always do. I'll pick up extra shifts at the diner, and we'll get by somehow." Ethan's heart ached at her words. His mother had always been strong, always willing to sacrifice for him. But he could see the toll it was taking on her, the lines on her face, the way she moved slower than she used to, the quiet pain in her eyes. She had been working nonstop since his father left years ago, doing everything she could to provide for him. And now, Ethan had let her down. "I should have done more," Ethan muttered, his voice filled with frustration. "I should have found a better job, should have saved more money." Sophie shook her head gently. "You've done more than enough, Ethan. You're a good son, and I'm proud of you. Don't ever forget that." But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of failure. He had tried so hard to keep everything together, to protect his mother from the harsh realities of their financial struggles. And now, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. The following days were a blur of anxiety and frustration. Ethan spent hours applying for jobs, scouring online listings and following up on leads, but nothing seemed to pan out. Ridgewood was a small town, and opportunities were limited. Each rejection felt like another blow to his confidence, another reminder of how little control he had over his life. But amid the chaos, there was one glimmer of hope. Mark. Ever since their conversation in the park, Mark had been brainstorming ways for them to make money outside of the traditional job market. They had both grown up doing odd jobs around town, fixing fences, mowing lawns, cleaning gutters, and Mark was convinced they could turn those skills into something more. One evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table staring at his laptop and wondering how they would pay the rent that month, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. "Mark, got an idea? Meet me at the park in 30? Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, eager for any distraction from the overwhelming weight of his problems. When he arrived at the park, Mark was already there, sitting on the swings and scrolling through his phone. He looked up when he saw Ethan, a grin spreading across his face. "Dude, I've been thinking," Mark said, standing up to greet him. There's gotta be a way for us to make some cash without relying on these dead-end jobs. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Like what? Freelancing, Mark replied, pulling out his phone and showing Ethan a few websites. People are always looking for help with random stuff. Repairs, moving, cleaning, whatever. We can set up profiles, advertise our skills, and get paid for doing what we're already good at. Ethan studied the screen, intrigued by the idea. You think people will actually hire us? Mark nodded enthusiastically. Definitely. Plus, I know some guys who buy recyclables directly. We could make more money selling to them instead of going through the usual places. It's not glamorous, but it's money. Ethan felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't the most conventional plan, but right now, he needed something, anything, to bring in some income. Let's do it, Ethan said, determination filling his chest. I'm in. The next few weeks were a blur of late nights, odd jobs and restless thoughts. Ethan threw himself into the freelance work with Mark, desperate to bring in money and keep his mind occupied. They worked on repairs, cleaned out basements, and even helped a few people move. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Ethan afloat, enough to stave off the crushing guilt of losing his job and leaving his mother to shoulder the financial burden alone. But despite the physical labor, Ethan's mind remained fixated on the injustice of it all. On Matt Reynolds, who had stolen from Beth and James and suffered no consequences. On Tom Harris, who had fired him for doing what was right. And on the people like Beth and James who continued to struggle, while the wealthy and powerful lived without a care. Mark had urged him to be patient, to keep their heads down and focus on earning money. We can't risk going after Matt, Mark had warned one night as they loaded scrap metal into a truck. Tom will find a way to ruin us, and we'll lose everything. Ethan knew Mark was right. But the more he thought about it, the more the anger simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. He couldn't stand the thought of Matt walking free, living his privileged life while people like the Carters were barely surviving. There had to be a way to expose the truth, to make sure Matt paid for what he had done. It was during one of these long nights of work that Ethan received a message that would change everything. He and Mark were fixing a broken fence for an older couple on the outskirts of town when his phone buzzed. Wiping sweat from his brow, Ethan pulled the phone from his pocket and saw the text. Lucas, another one of Ethan's co-workers from Carlson's, had reached out. Lucas, you need to hear this. Meet me after your shift tonight. Something big's happening. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Lucas wasn't the type to message him out of the blue, especially with something cryptic. He had kept a low profile at Carlson's since Ethan had been fired, afraid of losing his own job. But something in his message told Ethan that Lucas had uncovered something important. Later that evening, as the sky turned dark and the cool air settled over Ridgewood, Ethan met Lucas in the parking lot of the local diner. The lot was nearly empty, save for a few trucks parked along the edges. Lucas stood near the back, his hands in his pockets and his face pale. Ethan, Lucas said as soon as Ethan approached, I need to tell you something. Something I saw. Ethan frowned, his heart pounding. What is it? Lucas glanced around, as if to make sure no one else was listening, before lowering his voice. I was cleaning up the back office today. Tom was talking to Matt, and I overheard them. Ethan's pulse quickened. What did they say? Lucas hesitated, his eyes filled with worry. They were talking about the Carters. Matt? Matt admitted to taking their wallet that day. But what's worse, Tom knows about it. He's covering for him. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had suspected it, but hearing the confirmation filled him with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Tom knows? Ethan repeated, his voice tight. Lucas nodded. Yeah. He told Matt to keep quiet, and that they'd bury the whole thing if anyone asked. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but it's clear they're working together to cover it up. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, rage boiling inside him. He had been fired for trying to help, and now the very people who had wronged the Carters were getting away with it. This isn't right, Ethan muttered, pacing in frustration. They can't just get away with this. I know, Lucas said quietly. But what are you going to do? Tom's got the store, the money, the connections. Even if you say something, who's going to believe you? Ethan stopped pacing, his mind racing. Lucas was right. Tom had all the power. But Ethan couldn't just sit by and let this happen. He had to find a way to expose the truth, to make sure that Beth and James got the justice they deserved. "We need proof," Ethan said finally, his voice filled with determination. "If we can get something on Matt, something concrete, then we can bring it to the public. Tom won't be able to protect him forever." Lucas looked nervous, but he nodded slowly. "All right. I'll keep my ears open. But be careful, Ethan. If Tom finds out what we're doing, it won't end well for either of us." Ethan walked home that night, the cold air biting at his skin as his thoughts churned. He couldn't stop thinking about what Lucas had told him. About Matt and Tom. About the theft. About the cover-up. It was all so deeply unfair. How could people like Matt and Tom, who had everything handed to them, think they could take from those who had nothing? The injustice of it burned inside him, fueling a fire that had been smoldering for weeks. He had spent so long trying to keep his head down, trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to knock him down. But now, he couldn't stay silent any longer. Not when people like Beth and James were suffering because of Matt's greed. By the time Ethan reached his apartment, a plan had begun to form in his mind. He needed proof, something undeniable, something that would force the truth into the light. But gathering that proof wouldn't be easy. Tom had eyes everywhere, and Ridgewood was a small town. One wrong move, and Tom would shut him down before he even had a chance to expose Matt. Ethan spent the next few days carefully watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment. He continued to work with Mark on their freelance jobs, but his mind was always elsewhere, focused on gathering the information he needed. He stayed in touch with Lucas, who had become his inside source at Carlson's. Every night they exchanged messages, piecing together the puzzle of Matt's theft and Tom's cover-up. The tension was palpable, like a ticking clock counting down to something inevitable. One night, as Ethan sat at his kitchen table reviewing the notes and messages Lucas had sent him, he heard a soft knock at the door. His mother, Sophie, was already asleep, so Ethan moved quietly to answer the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see Beth Carter standing on the other side, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the hallway light. "Mrs. Carter," Ethan said, his voice filled with concern. "Is everything all right?" Beth gave him a tired smile, though her eyes were heavy with worry. "I'm sorry to bother you, Ethan, but I didn't know who else to turn to." Ethan quickly invited her inside, guiding her to the small living room. She sat down on the worn couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Please don't apologize," Ethan said gently. "What's going on?" Beth took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly. "It's James. He's not doing well. The medical bills are piling up, and I don't know how we're going to afford his medication anymore." Ethan's heart ached at her words. He had known things were bad for the Carters, but hearing it spelled out like this made it all the more real. They were good people, kind, hardworking, and generous. And yet they were being crushed under the weight of a system that seemed determined to leave them behind. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Carter," Ethan said, his voice filled with sympathy. "I wish I could do more to help." Beth shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "You've already done so much for us, Ethan, more than anyone else would. But I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like we're running out of time." Ethan sat beside her, feeling a surge of emotion rise in his chest. He couldn't stand to see Beth and James suffer like this, not when he knew there was something he could do to help. "There's something I need to tell you," Ethan said softly. "Something about what happened at the store that day." Beth looked up, her eyes filled with confusion. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain everything, but he knew he couldn't keep it from her any longer. "I think Matt Reynolds took your wallet that day," Ethan said quietly. "And I think his father, Tom, knows about it. They've been covering it up." Beth's eyes widened in shock, her hands flying to her mouth. "What? But why?" Ethan shook his head, his jaw clenched in frustration. "Because they think they can get away with it. Because people like Matt and Tom think they're above the rules." Beth was silent for a moment, her expression filled with disbelief. "I can't believe it. After everything we've been through?" "I'm trying to get proof," Ethan continued, his voice determined. "Lucas is helping me. Once we have enough, we're going to expose them. We're going to make sure they can't get away with this." Beth wiped away a tear, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Thank you, Ethan. You've already done so much for us, and now I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Ethan replied, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to make this right, I promise." As the days passed, Ethan's plan slowly began to take shape. He and Lucas worked tirelessly to gather more information, documenting everything they could about Matt's theft and Tom's involvement in the cover-up. Every night, Ethan reviewed their findings, carefully organizing the evidence into a file that he hoped would be undeniable. But with each passing day, the pressure mounted. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Ethan knew that if Tom or Matt caught wind of what they were doing, it could all fall apart. They had to move carefully, strategically, and with absolute certainty. One afternoon, while Ethan was working with Mark on a repair job for an old neighbor, he received a call that sent his heart racing. It was Lucas. "Ethan," Lucas said breathlessly, "I've got it. I've got the proof we need." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "I managed to get access to the security footage from the day the Carters came in," Lucas explained. "It shows Matt in the parking lot picking up their wallet and pocketing it. It's all there, clear as day." Ethan felt a surge of relief and triumph. This was it. The proof they had been waiting for. With the security footage, there would be no denying what Matt had done. "Lucas, you're a genius," Ethan said, his voice filled with excitement. "Send it to me as soon as you can." "I'll send it now," Lucas replied. "But be careful, man. Tom's not going to go down without a fight." Ethan knew Lucas was right. They had the proof, but now they had to decide how to use it. Ethan's heart raced as he stared at his phone, the security footage Lucas had just sent still playing on the screen. It was undeniable. The video showed Matt Reynolds standing in the parking lot of Carlson's Market, his eyes scanning the ground until they landed on the wallet Beth and James Carter had unknowingly dropped. The next moments were clear. Matt looked around, pocketed the wallet, and walked away, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The proof he and Lucas had been waiting for. After weeks of frustration, of trying to find a way to expose the injustice, they finally had what they needed. "Did you get it?" Lucas asked over the phone, his voice tense with anticipation. "I got it," Ethan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's everything we need." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Ethan could hear the relief in Lucas's exhale. "So what now? What's the plan?" Ethan stood up, pacing the small living room of his apartment. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. They had the proof, but now they had to figure out how to use it. Tom Harris, Matt's father and the store manager, wasn't just an ordinary person. He held power and influence in the town, and Ethan knew that confronting him directly could lead to backlash. If they weren't careful, they could lose everything. But he also knew they couldn't wait any longer. Beth and James were suffering. His mother was barely hanging on, and Ethan himself had lost too much already. It was time for the truth to come out, no matter the consequences. "We take it public," Ethan said firmly, his voice filled with resolve. "We send this to the local news. If we try to go through official channels, Tom will find a way to bury it. But if we go public, if the whole town sees this, Tom won't be able to stop it." Lucas hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll get it to the Ridgewood Gazette. They've covered stuff like this before. If we send it to them, they'll run with it." "Good," Ethan replied, feeling a surge of determination. "Let's do it." The next day, Ethan sat at Carter's Corner, the small cafe that had become his sanctuary over the past few weeks. The place was quiet, save for a few regulars sipping coffee and reading newspapers. Beth Carter was seated at one of the back tables, staring out the window, her thoughts seemingly far away. Ethan had invited her to meet him, but he hadn't told her everything yet. He didn't want to raise her hopes until he was sure the truth would come out. As Ethan approached her table, Beth looked up, her face lighting up with a tired but grateful smile. "Ethan, dear, it's good to see you." "It's good to see you too, Mrs. Carter," Ethan replied, sitting down across from her. He took a deep breath, knowing the conversation they were about to have would be difficult. "There's something I need to tell you." Beth frowned slightly, her eyes full of concern. "What is it? Is something wrong?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then decided to lay it all out. "I know who took your wallet that day at the store. It was Matt Reynolds." Beth's eyes widened in shock. "Matt? But how?" Ethan pulled out his phone, showing her the security footage Lucas had sent him. "This is the proof. He took it when you and Mr. Carter were leaving the store. And his father, Tom, he knows. He's been covering it up." Beth stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the video play. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked up at Ethan, her voice trembling. "How could they do this? We've known them for years. I thought they were good people." Ethan's heart ached for her. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Carter. I didn't want to believe it either, but this is the truth. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows." Beth wiped away a tear, nodding slowly. "Thank you, Ethan. You've done more for us than anyone else would have. I don't know how we'll ever repay you." "You don't have to repay me," Ethan said softly. "I just want to make things right." As they sat in silence, Ethan's phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Lucas. "Lucas, it's out. The Ridgewood Gazette is running the story. Be ready for fallout." Ethan stared at the message, his heart racing. It had begun. The following day, the fallout began. Ethan had barely woken up when his phone started buzzing non-stop. Texts, calls, and social media notifications flooded in. The story had broken. The Ridgewood Gazette had published an article titled, "Carlson's Market Scandal. Manager's Son Accused of Theft and Cover-Up." The article included the security footage, along with a detailed account of how Matt had stolen the wallet and how Tom had tried to cover it up. Ethan scrolled through the article, his heart pounding as he read the comments pouring in from the townspeople. Some expressed shock, disbelief that the Reynolds family could do such a thing. Others were furious, demanding that justice be served. But one thing was clear: Ridgewood would never be the same. As Ethan made his way to Carter's corner, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He had wanted justice for Beth and James, but now that it was happening, the reality of it felt overwhelming. What would happen to Matt and Tom? How would the town react in the long run? And what would the consequences be for him? When Ethan arrived at the cafe, the atmosphere was tense. Mark was already there, sitting at their usual table, his face pale. "Dude," Mark said, looking up as Ethan approached, "it's all over the place. People are talking about it everywhere. I heard Tom's already called a lawyer." Ethan sighed, sitting down across from him. "I figured he would." Mark leaned in, lowering his voice. "You think they'll try to go after you? I mean, you're the one who exposed all of this." "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but I don't regret it. Beth and James deserved the truth." As they spoke, the door to the cafe swung open, and in walked Tom Harris. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as Tom's gaze locked onto him, his face a mask of controlled fury. The entire cafe seemed to go silent as Tom made his way toward their table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. "Davis," Tom said coldly, stopping just a few feet away, "we need to talk." Ethan stood up, his heart racing but his expression calm. "About what, Mr. Harris?" Tom's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. "You've ruined my family's reputation. You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know the damage you've caused." Ethan met Tom's glare, his voice steady. "I didn't cause the damage, Mr. Harris. Matt did when he stole from the Carters. And you did when you tried to cover it up." Tom's face reddened with anger. "You're going to regret this, Davis. You think you're untouchable because you went public? I'll make sure you pay for what you've done." Ethan felt a surge of defiance rise within him. He had spent so long being afraid, of losing his job, of disappointing his mother, of failing the people he cared about. But now, standing face to face with Tom Harris, he realized something important. He wasn't afraid anymore. "I'm not the one who needs to pay," Ethan said calmly. "You and Matt are." Tom's eyes blazed with fury, but before he could respond, a voice from across the room cut through the tension. "That's enough, Tom." Ethan turned to see Beth Carter standing near the entrance, her eyes filled with quiet determination. She walked slowly toward them, her gaze never leaving Tom's. "You've done enough harm to this town," Beth continued, her voice steady but firm. "It's time for you to face the consequences." Tom's face twisted with rage, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the cafe, leaving behind a tense silence. Beth stood beside Ethan, her presence calming the storm that had just passed. "You did the right thing, Ethan," she said softly. "Don't ever doubt that." In the weeks that followed, the scandal surrounding Matt Reynolds and his father continued to unfold. The story had gained traction far beyond Ridgewood, with local news outlets picking it up and running segments about the theft, the cover-up, and the fallout. The town was in an uproar, with many calling for Tom to step down as manager of Carlson's Market, and for Matt to be charged with theft. Ethan's life, too, had changed. While some people praised him for exposing the truth, others, particularly those loyal to the Reynolds family, blamed him for the chaos that had ensued. He had become something of a local celebrity, though not always in a positive way. Despite the mixed reactions, Ethan knew he had done the right thing. Beth and James Carter had finally received justice, and Matt and Tom were facing the consequences of their actions. Carlson's Market had come under investigation for several other instances of misconduct, and it seemed only a matter of time before Tom was forced to step down. But amid all the turmoil, Ethan's focus remained on the people who mattered most. He continued to work with Mark on their freelance jobs, finding satisfaction in the honest work they were doing, and he spent as much time as he could with his mother, helping her with the bills and making sure she was taking care of herself. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, Ethan sat at the kitchen table going over their finances. The money he and Mark had made from freelancing was helping, but it wasn't enough. They were still behind on the rent, and Sophie's medical bills continued to pile up. As Ethan stared at the stack of bills, a familiar feeling of helplessness washed over him. He had done everything he could to make things right for the Carters, but his own life was still full of uncertainty. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Ethan frowned, not expecting anyone at this hour. He opened the door to find James Carter standing on the other side, holding an envelope in his trembling hands. "Mr. Carter?" Ethan said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" James smiled weakly, though his eyes were filled with gratitude. "I came to thank you, Ethan, for everything." Ethan shook his head, stepping aside to let him in. "You don't have to thank me. I just did what anyone would have done." James's smile widened, though his voice remained soft. "No, Ethan, you did what no one else had the courage to do. You stood up for us when we couldn't stand up for ourselves." He handed Ethan the envelope, his hands shaking slightly. "This is for you. It's not much, but it's a way for us to repay you for what you did." Ethan stared at the envelope, confused. "Mr. Carter, I don't need anything from you. You've been through enough already." "Please," James insisted, his voice filled with sincerity. "Take it. You've earned it." Reluctantly, Ethan opened the envelope. Inside was a check, a significant sum of money, far more than Ethan had expected. "Where did this come from?" Ethan asked, shocked. "We sold the old bookstore," James explained quietly. "It was time, and we wanted to use the money to help the people who have helped us." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. "Mr. Carter, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," James replied, his voice full of warmth. "Just keep being the good person you are." The money from Beth and James Carter had been a lifeline for Ethan and his mother. With it, they were able to pay off their outstanding bills and finally find some financial stability. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like they could breathe again. But more than the financial relief, the Carters' gift had given Ethan something even more valuable: a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent so long fighting for survival, for justice, that he had forgotten what it felt like to dream about the future. As the months passed, Ethan continued to work with Mark on their freelancing jobs, but he began to think about what came next. He had learned so much over the past year, about resilience, about kindness, about standing up for what was right, and now he wanted to do more. With the money he had received from the Carters, Ethan decided to take a leap of faith. He rented a small storefront in Ridgewood and opened his own repair shop, a place where people could bring their broken things, knowing they would be treated with honesty and respect. He named the shop Second Chances, a nod to the belief that everyone and everything deserved an opportunity to start over. The shop quickly became a hub of activity, with locals stopping by not just for repairs, but for conversation and connection. Ethan had created a space where people could come together, just like Carter's Corner had done for the community. And as Ethan stood in the shop one afternoon, watching as customers came and went, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had found his path, not just as someone who fixed things, but as someone who helped others find their way forward. As Ethan stood in his newly opened shop, watching the people of Ridgewood come and go, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. From the uncertainty of losing his job, to the fight for justice for the Carters, to finding his own path. It had all been a journey shaped by small acts of kindness and courage. Now, with his repair shop thriving and his sense of purpose restored, Ethan knew that the best was yet to come. His story was proof that even in the darkest of times, hope could shine through. And if there was one thing he had learned, it was that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, it was always worth fighting for what was right. If you've been moved by Ethan's journey and want to see more stories like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Join us for more heartfelt stories about perseverance, kindness, and the power of never giving up. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an update. There's so much more to come. Stories that will inspire you, uplift you, and remind you of the good in the world. Subscribe now, and let's keep this journey going together.